Alright, I'm going to do a little literature review and to tell you that a lot of the information I'm going to give you tonight is based on research. Part of it is the biggest gay organization in Israel, the umbrella organization of all the gay organizations, the queer organizations in Israel, is the Aguda, and this is their emblem, as was sponsored by the Israeli Ministry for Tourism, as Tel Aviv was declared the Mecca of the gay Middle East. Next slide, please. This book, Journey in the Holy Land between Salome and Eden, was written by a good friend of mine, Lee Walter. Lee Walter is an attorney right here in Washington, D.C., and he wrote his insights, published a book in the year 2000, and talked specifically about the Israeli military, about gay Palestinians, and so on and so forth. So the presentation is partially based on his book as well. Next slide, please. The other book is the Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It's a book that summarized the conference that I attended back in 2000, December 2000, that talked about the experience of queer non-commissioned officers and enlisted soldiers in several countries. There were representatives from Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, and I represented the state of Israel. Next slide, please. All right. Another friend of mine, Danny Kaplan, published this book. He focused on fighters of the Israeli military, about people who are out or in the process of coming out in the Israeli military. And he published his book both in English and in Hebrew. Next slide, please. All right. Service in the Israeli military is mandatory for men and for women. Men have to go for 3 years and women for 2 years. Israel is one of the only countries in the world that requires women to serve for 2 years. This is an image from the 60s. You can see the Uzis, again, that were made in Israel as well. Next slide, please. All right. Something that I focused a lot, why Israel was able to abolish the discriminatory policy against gays in the military back in 1993, while at the very same year, President Clinton was trying to do the same thing in the United States and failed. Israel was trying to do the same thing in 1993 and it worked, and President Clinton was not able to do that. I'm going to give you my own theory, which is not necessarily supported by others, but this is something that I found very interesting. I think the reason is the Prime Minister of Israel at that time, Yitzhak Rabin, here you see him with President Clinton, and King Hussein of Jordan. Yitzhak Rabin was the chief of staff of the Israeli army during the 1967 war, during the Six-Day War. He had an immense credibility as a military commander, and when he was the prime minister, he appointed himself also to be the minister of defense. When Yitzhak Rabin realized that the policy discriminates against gay Israelis is unjustified, he, as a minister of defense, single-handedly signed this executive order that basically opened up the Israeli army for service, or lifted the ban of against service of queer people in the Israeli army. And he did it in 1993. The very same year, President Clinton was trying to do the same thing. President Clinton had been elected the year before, in 1992, and what he was lacking is the experience in foreign policy and military credibility, because President Clinton did not serve in the U.S. military, and before he became the President of the United States, he was the governor of Arkansas. As the governor of Arkansas, he didn't have a lot of experience in foreign policy, because Arkansas doesn't have a lot of foreign policy, and he didn't have military experience because he was the commander-in-chief of the Arkansas National Guard, a mighty force that did not give him a lot of credibility. When President Clinton was trying to do that, basically the chief of staff of the U.S. military that at that time was Colin Powell came to him and said, "Mr. President," not in those words, but he said, "Mr. President, we have to continue this discrimination. This is the way the military works. while for Rabin, it was not the case. If we would imagine a conversation between the commander of the Northern Command of the Israeli army, and for years the Northern Command of the Israeli army was the most prestigious command in the Israeli army because it defends Israel against Syria and against Lebanon. If the commander of this command would come to Prime Minister Rabin and say, you know, Mr. Prime Minister, if you allow queer people into the Israeli military, I cannot guarantee the security of the State of Israel against Syria and Lebanon, Rabin would probably tell him what they say in Israeli slang, leave my office and leave your keys on my desk, the keys to your car, because you're fired. Because everybody else wants the position of being the commander of the Northern Command of the Israeli army. Rabin had the credibility, because he served himself as a commander of the Northern Command, to tell people, like he told us when we were young officers, you guys can do it because I did it. I was a role model. I fought for the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 against 7 Arab armies. I was the chief of staff during the Six-Day War when Syria and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and Egypt threatened to destroy the State of Israel. He had this military credibility to come and tell people, I was able to do it. He was a true role model, and this is a position that President Clinton did not have. That's why it didn't work in the United States, and the discriminatory policy of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell was abolished officially only this morning. Okay, Israel did it in 1993. Right now, we're in 2011. Next slide, please. All right, Uzi Evan. Uzi Evan was the chairperson of the chemistry department at Tel Aviv University, a very brilliant scientist who is gay, was never tried to hide it. He lives with his husband in Tel Aviv, and they adopted a son. He was never trying to hide the fact that he was gay. However, the Israeli army discovered in the 80s that he was gay, and he was demoted from a rank of a captain to a rank of a sergeant, and then he was very upset. 1992, Rabin was elected the Prime Minister of Israel, but also Yael Dayan, the daughter of Moshe Dayan, Israeli general, was elected to the Israeli parliament as well, and she was commissioned with the position to be the chairperson of the Committee for the Advancement of Women, basically feminist issues in the Israeli parliament, and she single-handedly also added the queer community as well. She decided that she's going to do a hearing in the Israeli parliament, in the Knesset, for the queer community. Of course, the ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel were against it. They said, we're not going to let queer people into the parliament, which of course just brought more publicity to the event. And representatives of the queer community came and gave a testimony. Uzi Evan gave a testimony, and he was talking about his contribution to the Israeli army as a very brilliant professor, and then the fact that he was demoted just because he was gay, despite the fact that he never tried to hide it. I just remember at that time I was second lieutenant or a captain, driving with my driver in the Galilee in Israel, and my driver was saying, this doesn't make any sense. If people contribute to their country, the sexual orientation is irrelevant. And apparently my driver was not the only person who thought about it, because those testimonies, the whole country listened to it because the ultra-Orthodox parties gave so much publicity to the event. Everybody was listening to it, and that's what prompted Prime Minister Rabin to change the policy very easily in 1993. Okay? Next slide, please. All right. This is my theory. Again, I talked to Uzi Evan, and Uzi Evan is not going to confirm or deny anything that I'm going to tell you right now. Israel keeps a policy of ambiguity about its nuclear capabilities. So Israel does not declare whether it has a nuclear bomb or doesn't have a nuclear bomb. However, because this is a small group and we're all friends right now, I can tell you Israel does have a nuclear bomb, just don't tell anybody. This is just between us, okay? And then, actually, if you read some books, Israel has about 200 nuclear bombs, and this is one of the books. It's not the only book, but it's one of the books that details the Israeli nuclear program. My assumption is that with the position of Uzi Evan as the chairperson of the chemistry department at Tel Aviv University, Uzi Evan must have had something to do with that. And this fact was known, well known, to Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. And I think he said to himself, those people contributed immensely to the technological advancement of Israel as a society. They definitely can contribute in all positions of Israeli society. Next slide, please. All right, the Israeli army is actually so open about gays serving in the military that the gay community in Israel is having like a regular competition every year to elect Men of the Year. That's the way they call it. The people can apply, and there's a competition. There's a lot of criticism within the queer community in Israel and outside the queer community in Israel that this is a meat market, and participants say that if they're going to win, they're going to contribute to world peace, just like we see here in the United States. Nothing is different in Israel. However, the Israeli army was so open that they allowed one soldier in uniform, you can see him right here, okay, to participate. And this picture was published in the Gay, Mr. Gay Israel Contact. It was published like all over Israel in dozens and dozens of locations all across the country. And he was in uniform. So it was so open that the Israeli army was actually very proud of the fact that its soldiers are gay and wanted to even support them in this competition. Next slide, please. This is the same picture, just the people without the uniform. See, and because they, I guess, were upset with ultra-Orthodox, you can see them wear the Santa Claus outfit, or at least part of it. We can move on, I assume. All right, the three positions, or the legal status of queer people in Israel is better than their status in the United States of America. And there are three areas that I'm going to focus on tonight and talk about them. The first one is discrimination in the workplace. In the United States so far, we do not have a federal law that protects all gay people against discrimination in the workplace. That means that in many states in the United States, it's a state law, but not all states chose to enact it. So we have many segments of the United States of America, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Arkansas, that do not have this law. That means that people can be fired from their job just because they are queer. This is the reason. This could be the official reason, and they have nothing to do because they are not protected by the law. In Israel, 1993, the Knesset, Israeli parliament, legislated this law that protects queer people from discrimination in the workplace, and people cannot lose their job just because they're queer. Again, I witnessed that myself when I was a student at the University of Texas at Austin, and just like I'm sure there are many students here that get some financial aid or scholarship. I was getting a scholarship from the university, and my whole life was based on this scholarship because I needed to be a teaching assistant. It was part of the requirements of the scholarship, and that covered my tuition and some living expenses. And at that time, I started to be very interested in queer theory. So I started to check out books from the libraries that dealt with queer theory. And every book I would check, I would think, would my professors have access to it? The chair of my department was a very brilliant Palestinian professor who I worked with very closely. And I assumed that he was a very conservative person, and I knew that he could definitely have the right to dismiss me, to fire me, to say, well, you work for the state of Texas, you're not protected, and you could just be fired. And I actually went to legal departments, and they told me, you will have nothing to do if they fire you. So this, it ended up all being fine, and I wasn't, but just the thought that I had every time that I checked every book was very difficult for me just to do academic research. So it's a real issue for young people across the country who are not protected by the law. Next slide, please.